This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And I'm Yves Engler. And the Foreign Policy Hour is a weekly critical look at Canada's role internationally. And I'm going to try to get out on time tonight because there's something I'm supposed to do right after. And sorry, I'm running a little bit late here. There's a lot of developments in international affairs this week too, so I'm going to get right to it. There's a letter put out by the Americas Policy Group about the Canada-Ecuador Free Trade Agreement and how the government is not doing any sort of assessment of that agreement through the lens of feminist foreign policy and looking at the resource extraction, Canadian companies' resource extractions impacts in Ecuador. So the campaign challenging Canada's free trade agreement with Ecuador continues. Mali, the Globe and Mail business section had a story saying that Mali has put out an arrest warrant for the head of Barrick Gold, Bristow, forgetting his first name right now. He's a prominent, he's big player in the mining industry for a long time, and that's just a further sign of how serious Mali is in terms of getting more for its natural resources from foreign companies. And Barrick is a big player in Mali. Uh, so the Globe piece said that they're negotiating over this, but now Bristow doesn't want to go to the country, and so they're going to have to do it by Zoom or some other method. And there's a number of Barrick employees that are still detained in Mali. So the sort of nationalist push there seems to be, God, I guess, continuing, if you like. The New York Times had a kind of interesting profile of Melanie Joly, this very sympathetic profile about her difficulties, her claim that she rejected the foreign affairs gig, the offer to be minister because she's trying to get pregnant, having difficulty, and and this very sort of sympathetic, and then she got pregnant early on, and then she had a miscarriage, and they say that she got up in the interview and left the room when describing this. I'm sort of prepared to believe that she's has that's some of that's true. I'm actually quite skeptical of the idea that she rejected the position. I'm guessing that's as much likely part of her kind of her story she's trying to tell. And also Trudeau's response was, if you do get pregnant, we'll do whatever we can to allow you to keep doing the job. So this part of his kind of feminist policy, kind of, I would say, somewhat fake feminist policy, of course, but his sort of framing, and he likes to hype this story, and she's playing this up. The story kind of frames her. It's a political newcomer Trudeau elevated may succeed him. So it's kind of about how she's a successor to Trudeau. And it's, I would say that first of all, it kind of frames her as like just, she's just been, I think, and the final quote is she's been questioned her whole life or something like that. But my understanding is that her parents are like fairly prominent Liberal Party people. And this notion that she's just sort of like, had a rough go of it her life is just absolutely not based in fact. They are part of fairly kind of elite circles here in Montreal. And of course, the substance, they basically laud all the her foreign policy, but they put a little question mark about her decision to go to China. And they quote some, China hawk saying, "Oh, this is a big mistake to go to that." Jolie went to China. So basically, she's aligned with the U.S. empire on this one issue where maybe she seems like she bucked the U.S. empire a little bit, we put in a quote, put a critical comment. This is the kind of thing that obviously is very important for Jolie's, um, you know, reputation, and a number of Canadian media outlets talked about this profile, and she's clearly a very ambitious person, and I think moving towards trying to lead the party, and this is all part of that. In this story, it points out, and somebody had told me about this recently, just a couple weeks ago. She worked for some law firm, the Bronfman family. The New York Times points out the Bronfman family was a big contractor for this law firm. So I guess she did stuff with the Claridge, which is Stephen Bronfman, who was the lead fundraiser for Trudeau. Who's a real Bronfman fans being arch Zionist family, and they point out that she worked for Bronfman. They don't refer to Claridge, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is, which is the investment firm of Stephen Bronfman, which would add a layer to her sort of alignment with Israel. In a slightly different dynamic of a kind of profile of a Canadian politician, the National Post sort of had a profile of Aaron O'Toole, the former leader of the Conservative Party. And he says this thing in this. Well, he goes through a bunch of things that he's talking about in international. They do this interview. I think he's in the UK or something like that, where this interview gets done by Zoom. And in it, he points out a contrast that I found like really remarkable. And he's really stunning how it's the right wingers that do this and not the left. I don't think any NDP MP has been doing this. And he basically says something. I got the exact quote. How many debates in this country have we had about making our Paris targets? Well, there's been a target that's been existing for decades that's much more tangible than Paris targets. It's the NATO 2%. So he explicitly contrasts, we're basically spending too much time discussing the Paris target or trying to get the Paris target and not enough time on the military target. And to me, this is just like, speaks to how divorced from the actual security concerns of our world that Aaron O'Toole is, and by extension, Conservative Party and the political system, where he can kind of openly declare this, like, oh, well, the important target is the military target. The Paris target is unimportant. It's of course nonsense. If you go Kyoto Protocols goes back to 97, whereas the NATO target, I think it's first brought up in 2006 and then sort of solidified in 2014. So it's not even, if you even look at the timeline, like Paris, yes, the Paris climate negotiation is later, but the Paris is just building off of the earlier climate negotiations, most notably, most well known, the Kyoto Protocol that we failed to attain. But this is the state of kind of the political discussion and where people are at, where the Conservative Party's at, where they'll openly sort of bemoan talking about the existential crisis of the climate crisis, and contrast to that to the more military spending in the NATO target. And as I pointed out a number of times, the new head of NATO, I'm forgetting his first name, Rutt is his last name. He was quoted saying, 2% is simply not enough. It is simply not enough if longer term we want to keep our deterrence at the level that it is now. So they're all openly saying we got to go above 2%. The Business Council of Canada, the Maple has a story about this. Their report saying the 3%. So it's a full court press that now that we've sort of agreed to the 2%, that's not enough. We got to be moving up to the whatever it is, the 3%, the 2.5%, the 4%, the 8%. They'll keep asking for more, of course. And part of this sort of militaristic war is everywhere. We have to be preparing for this. Is the government came out with a new Arctic strategy, global affairs, and it says that the Arctic is no longer free from tension. And And so there's variations of seems to be putting ambassadors in more Arctic spots. Uh, uh, there's been all kinds of money devoted to militarizing the Arctic. That's not new, but that's sort of restated in this. Um, One of the things that the Globe points out, the Globe story about it, I haven't actually read the strategy yet. I haven't had a chance to read it. The Globe story about it points out that it refers to the North American Arctic 13 times in the document. And uh, and that seems to be some effort to make it clear that it's like Canada, the US are getting together and defending the Arctic. Now, part of the thing here is that Canada has all kinds of disputes with the US around territorial disputes with the US, waters on the Arctic. And so the Canada is actually, the sort of a threat to Canada's position in the Arctic is the US. And so the idea of kind of referencing it as the North American Arctic is a bit of speaks to just the extent to which they, this isn't about sovereignty per se. This is about anti-Russia, anti-China. They reference China a bunch in the document, according to the Globe, and of course Russia's is the central. And they frame it as the tensions started in the Arctic because of Russia. And I don't think that's correct. I think Russia did want to continue with all the different Arctic uh, agreements. The Council, forgetting what it's called right now, that the when Russia invaded Ukraine was Russia was excluded from. Um, it's Canada's reaction and other countries' reaction to Russia's invasion that has kind of upped the Arctic tension, and that's get into the whole legitimacy and not legitimacy of Russia's invasion, but that's the actual dynamic of heightening tension in the Arctic or lack of collaboration on a whole series of fronts in the Arctic that I think is needs to be kind of made clear. Um, and all this is again, this is all part of justifying increased Canadian military spending. I don't believe that Russia is a threat to Canada in the Arctic, and I certainly don't believe that China is a threat to Canada in the Arctic. It's very, very long distances to traverse the notion of Russian naval ships coming in and conquering uh, Canadian territory. There's also obviously the whole question of indigenous rights and the militarization on that front, and how they're trying to sort of I don't know, kind of basically use uh, Inuit people in that as a sort of um, um, I don't know what the word would be, but a sort of spearhead or their eyes and ears and sort of legitimate some of that when historically there's been a real ambivalence towards the militarization from the Inuit Circumpolar Conference and others. Um, on the note of Georgia, there's a lot of hot spots politically around the world right now, and I'm going to touch on a number of them quickly. There's obviously these protests in Georgia. I'm not following it that closely, but the basics are that the European Union is trying to push the government into uh, basically more and more concessions, uh, basically undermine its political mandate, the Georgia Dream Party, which my understanding was sort of attempting to be stay out of the geopolitics. And the European Union, knowing that most of the population wants to join the European Union, is just making more and more demands. And so the government is that are basically trying to sabotage that party, the ruling party, and and so they've put this sort of on pause. And then the president has said, "I'm not leaving," and claiming there's fraud in elections, though that's not not particularly well founded. And so there's protests, and this is somewhat people comparing it to the Maidan efforts. That kind of is a similar kind of dynamic to 2014, 2013, 2014 in Ukraine. Canada has, of course, been supporting this. I meant to talk about it last week. I haven't followed that closely, but 6 months ago, they, statements about this, about the NGO law. So they've joined in on this sort of EU, NATO kind of line, not in any substantive way. But this week, Melanie Joly announced that Canada was going to impose sanctions against those suppressing protests in Georgia. There's not many details beyond that are available, but they have announced that. So they're giving, they're bolstering the protest at minimum. I don't know how important these sanctions will be, but they certainly give life to the protests, and they add pressure on the government. And of course, all this is kind of in the context of trying to move further into what has traditionally been uh, part of the Russian sphere of influence, and and stir up tensions in those areas. Um, on another much more brutal dynamic on this front, the Ukraine file, there was a Ukrainian um, business investment conference that held, I think, in Toronto this week, and where Ukrainian officials were calling for more investment in the country, and speaking how important it was to the war against Russia and stuff like that. Um, the This is all, I think, at this point, it's just becoming abundantly clear that this really is a fight to the last Ukrainian. And Ukrainians are increasingly showing signs that they want out of this endless war. And polls are showing that the majority want to end the war. They want negotiations, despite the fact that there's very little political space or media space in the country to put forward that message. Um, Sorry, I got a lot of background volume here. And so, sorry about that. And so it's a fight to last Ukrainian, and the head of NATO says he wants less talk of peace negotiations and more talk of sending arms. Says that Ukraine's not strong enough yet for talks. If they only lose more, uh, according to Ivan Kachanovsky, he estimates that Ukraine's lost killed 140,000 killed and 560,000 wounded. That's what Kachanovsky's estimates are. I don't know his whole analysis for that. He says it's based upon U.S. Ukrainian admissions. He has shown to be a rigorous researcher, and I think correct in a whole bunch of things. So I think I take that as a fairly worthwhile, at least to consider number. Those are pretty wild numbers. 140,000 killed, 560,000 injured. And we're getting this growing push from the Americans, from the head of NATO, that they have to lower the conscription age to 18. And that's just, we got to send more teenagers. And there was a story, I don't know where, about basically this is just the decimation of this already somewhat limited generation because the birth rate dropped so much after the demise of the Soviet Union. So there aren't that many 18 to 25-year-olds. So you drop the conscription age and you have a whole bunch more of them killed. You already have many in that range killed already, or in similar range, and then you're going to just have bigger and bigger social toll going down, going forward in the country in Ukrainian future. And so this is what this is going. And so the Canadian government this week, they announced that this is very odd. The Associated Press story talks about this in antiwar.com. I actually saw it on antiwar.com and I questioned whether this was true. So I searched and it was from an Associated Press story. So I'm assuming this is correct. The Canadian government banned 324 types of firearms, but it's working to send these weapons to Ukraine. So at the announcement, which was done just before the Montreal massacre, which of course was on Friday, the commemoration of the Polytechnique massacre, they announced this banning of more types of firearms. I think they did the day before. They often do those announcements to time it with the Montreal massacre, and but then they're going to send these weapons to Ukraine. So to me, this is kind of like encapsulates the whole fight to last Ukrainian, right? So we don't want these weapons here, but we're going to send them all to Ukraine. And even though, like, they may be in the short medium term they will be used, to fight Russia. That may be what they'll be used for. But there is this whole history of a big black market in weapons in Ukraine and sort of, gang violence and the like associated with that. Uh, and so, even if they're used in the short or medium term as Russia, what's that going to do in terms of, like, more guns on the market and all that kind of stuff? So it's just, it just seems to me at this point just clearer and clearer that this is a policy of fighting to last Ukrainian, and they've the propaganda system it enables this because one way is that the demonization of Russia. So the Globe and Mail has a story where it quotes the governor of Kherson and of the oblast, and he says Russia demonstrates how they are not humans. So he's just calling you Russians not humans. And this is sort of in the Globe and Mail, no, reaction. This is just considered like a reasonable thing to say. And it's just, I mean, I don't think there's any way in which this would be helpful if you want to end this war, if you want negotiate a solution, if you want some form of long-term, living situation between the people who live next to each other. But that's still where we're at in the dominant media. There's absolutely no space in the Canadian dominant media for any questioning really of certainly like the Globe and Mail. Maybe the National Post is starting to allow some, not even really, but the Globe and Mail is just so one-sided on the proxy war. And one of the things I think kind of tied to the proxy war, the development this week, and there's no Canadian connection to this, but I thought I'd touch on it because it is part of this, I think, this sort of global upheaval, is what happened in Romania, where there's this presidential election, first round, and this person viewed as sort of a pro-peace, framed as a pro-Putin, far right figure. I don't know how correct this is. My guess is it's the person's uh, pro peace and conservative, but that he's being framed uh, so thusly, and um, but basically he wins the first round, and then they come out with the intelligence agency comes out and says there's this like Russian conspiracy, and they claim that there's this apparently, I don't know the details, but that what's his Tracy, forgetting the guy's name, American, sort of leftish, kind of all a little bit all over the place, journalist. I'm forgetting his first name. Uh, he basically it's all about on Twitter here. He says that they just it's about TikTok. They're saying that there's Russian accounts that have like manipulated this Romanian election, boosted this far right candidate by these TikTok accounts, and 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 there's what Tracy's saying. There's no evidence that there's like they've proven these are Russian. They're just that there's algorithms have shown that these accounts got like way more traction, which could likely be just that they're sort of the population is there's lots of discontent, and the population has got like interested in this candidate, and all of a sudden the TikTok videos that he's been making have just like exploded. I mean that would be a plausible scenario of political energy getting behind a politician. Anyways, they use this to just cancel election. The court just election has been canceled, and this is this is a EU country, this is a NATO country. There's all kinds of reasons why NATO would be very concerned with a candidate that was not on board for the proxy war to get in power in Romania. I don't know exactly what's going on in the background here, but that's, I think, possible. Um, on the note of global upheaval, you also had the French government fall, which is an interesting left-right dynamic, and I would assume it's connected to it would be partly a little bit connected, probably not substantially, a little bit connected to the NATO proxy war, probably also a little bit connected to a thing an issue we'll get to in a bit, which is the Syria, and of course the migration that came out of the Syrian war uh, had all kinds of political effects in terms of bolstering far right parties in Europe, lingering effects. But so you have a government fall in France for the first time, I think, like 50 years, 60 years. And then, of course, you have this coup effort. It seems in Korea, in South Korea, and I don't know. I don't know. There's as much of a Canadian angle to the French or the Korea issue. The Korea issue, I think, is a factor in this. Is the fact that this right wing president was pushing for tighter ties with Japan as part of the U.S. strategy of bringing Japan, South Korea closer together as part of combating China, with Australia, New Zealand a bit, and even the Philippines. So the Korea that's very unpopular in South Korea, of course, because South Koreans they remember the Japanese occupation and brutality, and so that my understanding is rapprochement with Japan is very a sensitive subject in Korea, South Korea, and that would of course would have been done sort of because Washington was pushing it. Now, obviously, the biggest sort of geopolitical thunder shock this week was Assad's fall, and Trudeau said, well, actually, I'll leave the Trudeau quote for a second. So the front page of the Globe today is all about Assad's fall. It's fascinating to see what's left out in the discussion. The fact that there's U.S. troops that are, 1,000 U.S. troops that control the oil, stealing its bunch of its wheat production. The fact that there's sanctions, brutal sanctions, that's all kind of left out in this Globe and Mail piece. They do admit that Israel is had some hand in all of this. The Israelis are boasting about that, and in terms of weakening Hezbollah and Iran, and that contributing to Assad's fall. Um, the kind of like the longer term war against Syria is mostly being left out of the mix. And I thought I'd go through a little bit of the Canada stuff. Canada put in 2012 they created this new um, definition of this sort of this list, terror list for state sponsors of terror, and Syria and Iran were put on that list in 2012. That happened after Canada adopted a series of rounds of sanctions against Syria after the Arab Spring, or during and after the Arab Spring, and so Canada had a whole bunch of sanctions, continues to have a whole bunch of sanctions against Syria. I don't think those have huge impacts on the Syrian economy, but they reinforce the U.S. sanctions and other country sanctions that do have really damaging effect, and its economy has collapsed. And it seems to me part of the reason why he fell. There's a bunch of factors here, but that the fact that the economic situation was not getting better despite relative peace, or relative kind of end to the fighting and the proxy war and the dirty war, whatever you want to call it exactly, uh, the civil war, that was hurting his support. That seems that very likely. Um, and So Canada was funding back in, I didn't write that much about Syria, but I went back and looked at some stuff I wrote in 2013. Canada was funded $5.3 million. They began a year earlier, basically to support the Syrian rebels' propaganda efforts. So there's a whole series there was the stuff about helping all these Nusra fighters, I believe, escape into Israel, that were basically being under siege, and Canadian diplomats helped, worked with Israelis to get them out of the country. There's stories like that came up. Like I said, the sanctions, listing it as a state sponsor of terror, the isolation of Syria. There was at one point in 2013, there was Canadian military officials looked like they were preparing they were joining a plan to sort of a military operations, formal military operations. Of course, there was the Americans timber Sycamoose, I believe, which is the huge Obama CIA late 2012 billions of dollars in training and arms to the different groups fighting against Assad. And most of this is mostly before, of course, any Russian or significant Iranian or Hezbollah intervention. And the so Canada, played a role in that. Now, there's lots of questions I have with regards to how to kind of process Syria, because I do think that I think it's a father to son dictatorship, 50 plus years father to son dictatorship. I don't think there's really very often where that's a good thing. Uh, and I do believe that it had pretty brutal intelligence agencies and prisons and stuff like that. And so I don't think that there's I don't want to defend Assad. Uh, but I think that to not have the geopolitics of this front and center is a big mistake as well. In that this obviously they enabled the axis of resistance, specifically with regards to getting weaponry and assistance from Iran to Hezbollah, most obviously, but also to some extent into the West Bank. And so so and they don't recognize Israel, unlike Egypt and Jordan, right? Syria doesn't recognize Israel, so there's a much more tense relationship. And Israel was clearly, they've been bombing for the last decade in Syria. In the last 14 months, they've bombed it more than 220 times. In the last like 48 hours, they've once claiming they've bombed 150 Israeli raids, military raids inside Syrian territory over the past like 48 hours. I don't know if that's correct, but Al Jazeera is reporting a whole bunch of them all, multiple spots across the country. And of course, Netanyahu went to the occupied Golan Heights and made a statement, and then they've moved troops and they invaded further into Syrian territory, and they're saying this is a buffer zone. They're saying this is short term. Israel's not generally great with the short term military occupations of Arab land. Those tend to end up being a little bit longer term. Um, so that's part of what's going on here. Now, Trudeau made his statement, said his on X, the fall of Assad's dictatorship ends decades of brutal oppression. A new chapter for Syria can begin, one free of terrorism and suffering for the Syrian people. I thought it was very interesting, and a number of people point this out, to use the word terrorism, because of course the group that is the main uh, uh, military force that took Damascus is a UN listed terrorist organization. And so, unlike Hamas and Hezbollah, which are not UN listed terror organizations, so and the Jolani, the CIA or the U.S. Embassy had a $10 million bounty on his head, as put out in 2017 or whatever. Though now there's all these reports that the Americans and the UK and even the UN are talking about taking HST. I can't. I always forget how to pronounce it. Off the terror list, and so the the uh, that question is fascinating to hear talk about terrorism, and when it's designated terrorist organizations taken um, power in Damascus. Now that gets into a whole broader question of this terrorist list, and Canada listed Ansar Allah or the Houthis as a terrorist organization a week ago, last Monday. I don't think I talked about it last week, uh, but so much of what the terrorist list is really just any group that Canada's terrorist list, at least, is any group that provides any challenge to Israeli colonialism and violence. And Canada's listing is directly in response to Ansar Allah basically stopping Israeli ships from the Red Sea and crippling the port at Eilat, the Israeli port. 85% or something like that of the traffic has declined as a result. And of course, we see that with the listing of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. They openly announce it's about Israel, and there's a piece in around the Samidun listing in the Tyee this week, unpacking Samidun's terrorism designation. That that is a very modest pushback against Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Network being added to the terrorist list. And and this, of course, is all happening while there's horrible Israeli Holocaust in Gaza, and Ansar Allah is challenging that. And there was no pushback on the Ansar Allah's listing. Literally, there was very little media attention on it, even, and no pushback from basically anyone, even in the Palestine solidarity world. Even though they're being listed very explicitly, the press release from the government even says that, and the Israel lobby is pushing for it, that it's because of their actions against Israel's genocide. And it just shows you how much the whole geopolitical discussion is just totally US empire Zionist dominated in our country. It's just the geopolitical discussion entirely dominated by that lens. And even the pushback on the IRGC being listed, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, 100,000 member, the pushback on that was that there would be individuals who were conscripted and who later migrated to Canada, and it was like not their fault that they were conscripted into IRGC, and that would be unfair to them if they got punished. Uh, so it's not the pushback is not geopolitical pushback, i.e., the IRGC is challenging Israel's genocide to an extent. I don't know how far I'd go with that, but in a more concrete way, the IRGC was challenging, the UN listed terror organizations in Syria. I mean, they were checking the power of ISIS and Nusra and others in Syria, and so there's a very good argument to be made that the IRGC was combating terrorism, but it gets listed as a terrorist organization. But you can't have those. There's just no space for that geopolitical discussion because our geopolitical discussion is just totally dominated by the U.S. empire Zionist lens, to the point where even pro-Palestinian groups or individuals don't even really push back on Ansar Allah being added to our terrorist listing. Now, quickly, I've gone on too long, like usual, but quickly through a few things. So the Amnesty said Israel's committing genocide, and the Globe and Mail, from what I could tell, didn't cover it. I don't know what other in the paper. I don't. They may have published something on their website. Didn't talk about the paper. Le Devoir put it on the front page. That was well placed. But they quote the Israeli consular here in Montreal in like paragraph 4, which is a pretty dubious. The Israeli historian, where's it got this name here? I don't have his name, but the Middle East Monitor story. Israeli historian produces vast database of war crimes in Gaza, basically showing another person, establishment voice saying it's a genocide. And in this, he says that the media propaganda and the war section of the media propaganda and the war, noting the current conflict has been, quote, enabled and facilitated by massive media efforts to shape discourse in Israel as well as in the West, in countries such as the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Germany. So explicitly citing Canadian media as part of this genocide justification that we've seen, and I think very much correctly. When Amnesty shows in a 300-page report that it's genocide, and the Globe and Mail doesn't even put that in the paper, even I didn't, maybe I missed something, but I'm pretty sure I didn't. Even a short brief, it's pretty remarkable. Many developments you're going to quick through. One thing, this Concordia University, there's a report came out about Canadian and US universities basically hiring these Israeli-aligned security firms. And Concordia has hired 2 of these security firms to basically monitor protest or undermine Palestine solidarity protests. One called Percentage International and Moshav Security Consulting. The SBHR Concordia has this TikTok video of it. People can check out, detailing some of their actions at Concordia. Randall Garrison, the Zionist NDP MP, who's not running again. B'nai B'rith, David Grunowski of B'nai B'rith, has a tweet with him. In his farewell speech, he addressed the rise of anti-Semitism. He said, solidarity matters when fighting hate, when it is directed towards my community or any other community in this country. And so the B'nai B'rith, as Randall Garrison exits, has this. Randall Garrison's a great guy. He's been defending our cause. Despite the Holocaust in Gaza, Garrison still is willing to meet with B'nai B'rith and willing to hype up the anti-Semitism panic. Quebec opened an investigation into 2 CEGEPs, English CEGEPs, for apparent insecurity for students around Palestine. And so basically, because students at Dawson voted 2-1 for that strike, and a bunch of Jewish students at the school started whining about how that makes them uncomfortable. The CAC government isn't going to investigate the colleges, which is all part of this, sort of authoritarian pushback. Anthony Housefather met with the Montreal police, and he came out of it saying that he suggested to the Montreal police that they should hire Toronto criminal attorney and Alliance for Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism founder Mark Sandler to come and train Montreal police as he has in Toronto and Vancouver. So the Montreal police need some of this anti-Semitism training from Anthony Housefather's guy because they haven't smashed enough heads of Palestine solidarity people. And I wanted to get to, maybe I'll just finish with this mix of positive and negative story. There was a really impressive Jews Against Genocide, Independent Jewish Voices occupation of a parliamentary building. I wasn't there; it was in Ottawa, of course, but 100 plus people. I think mostly Jewish, occupied, and this got pretty good attention, and a lot of the media framed it as Jews Against Genocide, occupied parliamentary building, whatever. And this just basically freaked out. People like Rabbi Mivaser was arrested, and people, the Israel lobby just had a totally like panicked, and they immediately got out this group, 19 groups. This is the National Post article saying 19 mainstream Jewish groups, including B'nai B'rith Canada, the Tafsik organization, and the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, said the protesters stood in direct opposition to the values of the Jewish community. And I think this kind of opens up an interesting question. Now, it is correct institutionally. I would say it's at like 98% of the Jewish Canadian institutions that are Zionist. You know, uh, now maybe that's not correct. Let's leaving aside Hasidic, because there is an important current in the Hasidic community that's anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. Leaving that aside, it's towards like 98%. It's overwhelming, right? And even like this Jewish museum that has this kind of like leftist bent that was set up maybe I think a decade ago or so on St. Hall Street here in Montreal, and like I would venture to guess if you talk to some people, I don't know these people, but if you they themselves are probably either anti-Zionist or sort of non-Zionist, right? But they're sort of like they're certainly not anti-Zionist in any of their kind of public facing. Because for good reason, right? The funding, like even the Winchevsky Center in Toronto, which is like left wing, critical of Israel, they get funding from United Jewish Appeal, Toronto, right, which is the sponsor of CJA, and this Jewish Museum here in Montreal, I almost certainly gets funding from the CJA Montreal, the Combined Jewish Appeal Montreal. So institutionally, it is overwhelmingly Zionist. Now, when you get into like the actual like Jewish population, that's a much a different question. And it opens up an interesting when they refer to groups like the Tafsik organization as mainstream Jewish groups. My understanding is this is some like really rabid, hardline racist organization, and they probably have hardly any members, right? Like even B'nai B'rith Canada. Now B'nai B'rith has a very high profile name, but at this point, it wouldn't surprise you if Independent Jewish Voices has as big of a list, email list, for instance, as B'nai B'rith does, maybe bigger. Maybe I'd be prepared to believe that IJV has, a higher proportion of IJV's list is non-Jews than B'nai B'rith's list. That's possible. I don't know, but at this point, IJV has I don't know what the exact number is. Like I think it maybe even like 2 dozen chapters across the country, and it certainly has hundreds and hundreds of very active members, and thousands and thousands of supporters or peripheral, probably tens of thousands. And so when you get into, the mainstream Jewish community, it is a very kind of fascinating question. Now, I do believe that most of Canadian Jewry is is Jewish supremacist. They are Zionists. They support a Jewish supremacist state. And I do believe that most support the genocide. They actively support uh, what's going on. But I think there are there's probably of the sort of 400,000 or so Canadian Jews, there's probably 100,000 that are clearly in disagreement with what Israel's doing right now, and maybe uh, half that are uncomfortable. Um, so it opens up some interesting questions, and I think the occupation was a is a very positive thing. A couple of other on the positive notes. Um, there was a, I think it was actually last Friday before, but I only saw it like on Tuesday. There the In Vancouver they were able to block the port Delta for multiple hours in solidarity with Palestine. Uh, the Giller Prize, they dropped a couple of the charges against those who protested the Giller Prize last year, and Canada voted for a UN resolution, um, peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine for the first time since 2004 at the UN. So there's a few positive notes of both resistance and actual policy effect. I'll leave it at that. And if people have comments or questions, I'd like to keep this to 7 or 10 minutes, and just be very quick and brief. Go ahead, Yuri, and I'll make Laura a co-host.
First of all, can you hear me okay, Eve?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, so much I could say about Syria, but I'll try to be very brief about it. But I just want to say that this is a huge tragedy, and I think this is not only that, but it's a huge blow to armed anti-imperialist resistance. And I think it's not something that anybody should be celebrating. I find it's and Syria, not, just a couple of months, I think just earlier this year when I was interviewing folks who cover Syria, I was saying to them that not since Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh or Cuba under Fidel Castro have we seen such a huge blow to Western imperialism and such a huge resistance to multiple Western, Israeli, Turkish, and Gulf imperialism on the country. And I find it's a huge tragedy. And I don't know if this means we need to step our game up because clearly, in terms of just the propaganda war alone, we've not accomplished all that much. And just the fact that Syria was able to fall without so much as even a huge anti-imperialist movement, I think is quite sad. There's there's a bunch more I could say in terms of the avalanche of propaganda that everybody keeps recycling, but look, history is on our side, and Syria is going to be a huge civilizational downgrade. It is going to be it is going to be it is going to be like the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. It is going to be like Libya, where you have multiple Islamist warring parties, and all I can say is shame on the people who still don't get that and are still recycling garbage about Assad this, Assad that. When well, that's just my 2 cents about it. I'm curious your response.
mean, I don't. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think it's really important that we center Canada's role, right? Like that. There's, you know, is it legitimate to put Syria on a state sponsor of terror? Is it legitimate for Canada to put money into, opposition, rebel, jihadist propaganda? Is it those kind of questions? Is it yeah. The other thing I think people have to kind of like get their head around is that there's no option liberal sort of a liberal like democracy of pluralist liberal democracy whatever you want to a social democratic kind of like you can't have that on Israel's border. There's no chance Israel is going to ever let. I mean, we know that going back to 1956 and invading Egypt when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and then destroying, Nasserism in '67. The, the reason of doing that is largely because Egypt was figuring itself out. It was making kind of like progressive social transformation. And progressive social transformation is antithetical to Israel's interests. They don't want the 250, 300 million people in the region to, you know, get it together, right? that they can't handle that. That it, would probably lead to the demise of Zionism because the region hates Israel. And so if the countries in the region, get strong and get economically developed and get whatever, right? That's just a threat to Israel. So Israel's not going to allow sort of pluralistic uh, you know uh, socialistic social transformation on its border. They're going to do everything they can to try to undercut that. And so, I don't want to live in a repressive state. Um, if you look at some of the but the situation is the situation. So I think that's an element that people have to consider in all this. And the other element, I think, is we have to make sure to prioritize the Canada's role in this sanctions, in this dirty war, because that takes us a bit away from the question of is Assad good, is Assad bad. I again, I don't, I think I don't like. I'm made uncomfortable by father to son dictatorships. Um, so I don't have any problem
That
saying
being
that.
said, all that being said, I'll just quickly respond to this. All that being said, I come from the Congo. We have Patrice Lumumba, who was a social democrat overthrown, and even though you can say whatever you want about Mobutu, that he stole millions and kept them into Swiss banks and all of that stuff, I can tell you the overthrow of Mobutu at the behest of the West and later having Rwandan proxy forces is actually immensely worse than all of the things they actually accuse Mobutu of, whether they're half truths or full on fake news.
Yeah.
And all these Western feminists and so forth who keep saying that, oh, if only the Middle East were more like this, oh, if only the Middle East were more like that. Okay, Assad had more socialist policies that he had accomplished and achieved in Syria than NDP ever achieves on the day when you're a fucking premier of a province.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, yeah. No,
All of that.
there's all kinds of contradictions when you get into some of the the stuff around. Basically, it was a fairly pluralistic. Uh, certainly in terms of religion and stuff like that. Versus certainly versus what's likely to be imposed or being imposed. But yeah, so
Okay, I think you want to keep it to 7 p.m. It's 7 p.m.
yeah,
and I think we can let you go.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, everyone.